episode of Real Talk. I'm your host, Josh, and today I wanted to talk about the indie film renaissance of the early to mid 90s. I came of age during the indie film renaissance, and a lot of those years shaped how I see cinema and creativity. In today's landscape of tentpole films, endless action blockbusters, I felt this urge that I needed to look back to what I view as a golden age when risk and originality thrive. So, this piece is both a reflection and a reminder of how deeply independent films inspired me and others like me, not just as entertainment, but as proof of what is possible. By revisiting that era, I find hope that the same spirit of rebellion and honesty still beats within the industry today. Ultimately, though, I just wanted to celebrate the past while staying optimistic about the future of film. When most people look back at the 90s, minds drift toward pop culture landmarks that define the era. We had grunge crashing into the mainstream with MTV blasting Nirvana and Pearl Jam into every living room, and flannel shirts becoming my personal uniform and the uniform of choice for anyone who wanted to look both fashionable but still disinterested. The decade also carried the hum of technological change, the slow dial-up buzz of the internet creeping into everyday life. We had home computers multiplying in living rooms, and the sense that the future was arriving faster than any of us expected. For myself and many of my friends, those were the defining features of the 90s. But it goes deeper for me. The true heartbeat of that decade wasn't measured in chords or modems, it was measured in frames of film. More specifically, it was the ragged, rebellious surge of independent movies that seemed to crash headlong against the shiny shoreline of Hollywood. What we now neatly call the indie film renaissance. It wasn't some distant cultural phenomenon. It was a living current that I could feel tugging at me, film by film, discovery by discovery. It wasn't just a shift in the kind of movies I was watching, it was a shift in how I thought about movies altogether. It was the decade that forced me to see cinema, not just as entertainment, but as possibility. It was messy, alive, deeply personal. And for the first time, I began to realize that filmmaking didn't have to belong only to the powerful, the wealthy, or the well-connected. To understand why this mattered, you have to picture what came before it. By the late 80s, Hollywood had preferred the blockbuster formula. Studios had learned that if you gave an audience spectacle, aliens, time travel, whip-cracking archaeologists, they would show up in droves. And truth be told, I love those films. I still do. E.T., Back to the Future, Indiana Jones, those movies shaped my childhood. They gave me heroes, and they made me dream bigger than whatever town I lived in. They felt larger than life, designed to dazzle. But at the same time, they also felt untouchable. The kind of stories only giant studios could conjure. As the years went on, the blockbuster magic became routine. Sequels churned out like clockwork. Effects grew louder, flashier, and scripts were engineered to hit every predictable beat. Studios doubled down on what was safe, and in the process, something was lost. Smaller, stranger stories, the kind that didn't involve time machines or world-saving battles. Those were drowned out. The kind of films that dealt with quiet heartbreak, awkward friendships, moral ambiguity, or just the day-to-day texture of ordinary life had no place in multiplexes. To me, it felt like Hollywood was serving dessert at every meal. sugar highs and spectacle, but it was denying us the sustenance of something more nourishing, more human. That vacuum wasn't exactly where a new generation of outsiders found their opening. Those filmmakers, they weren't insiders waiting for a studio greenlight. They were often broke, restless, and working on the fringes of the industry. Some were fresh out of film school. Others barely had film school in their rearview mirror, and many had no professional connections at all. So instead of trying to play by Hollywood's rules, they embraced that lack of resource. They started shooting on cheap film stock, writing dialogue-heavy scripts that could be filmed in apartments or diners. And they took stylistic risks that big studios never would have touched. Their attitude, it seemed to say, if we can't play your game, we're going to go invent our own. And the place where that reinvention got its spotlight was the Sundance Film Festival. Robert Redford had started the festival back in the late 70s, but by now, the early 90s, it had transformed from a regional showcase into indie cinema's beating heart. If Hollywood was the polished pyrotechnic stadium concert, Sundance was the garage band thrashing in someone's basement. You didn't always know what you were about to see, but what you did know was that it wouldn't be predictable. That sense of risk, of discovery, was exactly what made it so thrilling. I'll never forget hearing about Steven Soderbergh's Sex, Lies, and Videotape winning at Sundance in 1989. At first, the title alone turned heads. It sounded scandalous, almost like tabloid fodder. But the movie itself wasn't sensational in the way Hollywood might have packaged it. It was quiet, intimate, and deeply personal. It told a story with raw honesty, stripped completely of spectacle, and somehow managed to capture the world's attention. What Soderbergh proved with that film was nothing short of revolutionary. He proved that you didn't need studio millions or an army of special effects to make something that mattered. You could craft a film with a modest budget and a deeply human story, and it could still ripple through audiences worldwide. For someone like me, watching from the outside, coming of age at this time, this was electric. Hollywood films always felt like they belonged to another world. It was distant, it was glamorous, but it was impossible to touch. But now, there's proof that a single filmmaker working with very little could shake their way into the industry. It was as if the doors to cinema had been bolted shut for years. Soderbergh had walked up and kicked them wide open. Now, once those doors swung open, the flood rushed in. In total honesty, I didn't see Sex, Lies, and Videotape till later, but I read about it when it came out. But now, Sundance has become the place where discovery felt like destiny. You could walk in and stumble on a film made by someone who had maxed out their credit card, borrowed a friend's camera, or written a script in the margins of a day job. And suddenly that film might be the one everybody's talking about. That felt intoxicating. It meant the power of cinema wasn't locked away in some studio vault anymore. It was out in the open, in the hands of anyone bold enough to take the risk. Looking back, I realized that's what pulled me in so deeply. It wasn't just the films themselves. It was the sense of possibility that these films represented. These indie filmmakers weren't just breaking rules for the sake of rebellion. They were reminding the rest of us that stories mattered and that stories could come from anywhere. That was the pulse of the 90s for me. I loved grunge, I used the internet, but this was unstoppable. The do-it-yourself wave of creativity that made movies feel alive again. Once those doors opened, The flood came rushing in. It wasn't a slow trickle of interesting outliers. It was this absolute tidal wave of voices, each one breaking rules that I hadn't even realized were real rules until someone shattered them. Richard Linklater's Slacker was one of the first that hit me like that. On paper, it almost shouldn't have worked. Like Seinfeld, this is a movie with no real plot, a film that just drifts from one character to the next. But in this case, they never circle back. They never tie anything together with a neat bow. But watching it was like being handed this secret map of a place that had been there all along. The camera floated through Austin, Texas, catching fragments of overheard conversations and oddball characters. And instead of feeling disjointed, it felt alive. Every person seemed to belong to the same restless, slightly disillusioned generation. And every strange encounter felt like it was whispering, "This is life, unfiltered." And that's what made it revolutionary for me. Hollywood had taught us to expect tidy arcs, clear conflicts, and satisfying resolutions. Slacker refused to play by those rules, and it reminded us of the way life actually feels: messy, fragmented, constantly moving. The film didn't hand you a story, it just dropped you into a rhythm, a mood, a cultural pulse. For the first time, it was like realizing a movie didn't need to go somewhere in the traditional sense. Sometimes just existing in a moment, letting the camera roll on real voices, real quirks, that was enough. And for someone like me who had always loved movies but never thought of them as something ordinary, something we people can make, that was a revelation. Todd Haynes took that spirit and pushed it even further with Poison. His film didn't just step outside Hollywood's box, it lit that box on fire. Haynes stitches together three stories: a pseudo-documentary, a gothic horror, and a prison melodrama into a daring, confrontational work that refused to be safe or even palatable. It dealt openly with queerness and taboo at a time when mainstream cinema wouldn't even glance in that direction. Watching it felt unsettling, and that was the point. Haynes he wasn't trying to comfort anyone. He was demanding that audiences confront what made us uncomfortable. That kind of filmmaking is both intimidating and absolutely inspiring. It said movies don't just have to entertain you, they can challenge you, scare you, even implicate you. It broadened my understanding of what stories were allowed to do. Then came basically a hero to me, Kevin Smith, the everyman prophet of indie cinema. The legend of Clerks was irresistible. A guy working at a convenience store shoots a movie in the very aisles he stops, paying for it with maxed out credit cards. I remember watching it for the first time and being floored, not by the cinematography, there wasn't much of that, or the acting, because it was definitely rough around the edges, but by how real it all felt. The kind of conversations they were having were ones I'd had with my own friends. Absurd debates, crude jokes, dead-end arguments about nothing that somehow reveal everything. It was as if someone had bugged the kind of late-night conversations we thought nobody else cared about, and then turned them into a movie. Clerks made filmmaking feel attainable. It whispered, "You can do this too." And then, of course, there was Quentin Tarantino. My discovery of Reservoir Dogs and Pulp Fiction wasn't two separate events. It was one revelation unfolding in two acts. Reservoir Dogs was tight, claustrophobic, almost suffocating. Just a handful of criminals trapped in a warehouse, talking and betraying until everything unraveled in a bloody crescendo. The dialogue ricocheted between menace and some amazing, absurd comedy, and it created a tension that could live. And I didn't know tension could be in those places. It felt raw and dangerous. It felt impossibly cool. Then Pulp Fiction came along and blew the doors wide open. Where Reservoir Dogs was sharp and contained, Pulp Fiction sprawled like a fever dream. Its stories folded into one another. It scrambled up like puzzle pieces that only made sense once you stood back and you looked at the picture as a whole. Conversations stretched into strange tangents about cheeseburgers and foot massages. Yet every line cut with precision. The violence at times was shocking, but highly stylized, darkly funny, horrifying, and exhilarating all at once. Watching it felt like cinema itself had been reprogrammed in real time. So those two films together didn't just entertain me. They rewired my synapses about how I thought about movies. They made cinema unpredictable again, like anything could happen once the lights dimmed. What united Tarantino, Linklater, Haynes, Smith, Robert Rodriguez with El Mariachi, and countless others wasn't a single style, but a shared rebellion. Their films were jagged and imperfect in ways Hollywood couldn't imitate. They were raw in a cultural moment that craved authenticity, just as grunge ripped the polish off pop music. These filmmakers tore away Hollywood's gloss and said, here's something real, unvarnished, and alive. The timing was perfect. Technology was getting cheaper. Editing tools were becoming accessible. Home video and cult midnight screenings meant word of mouth could turn a $20,000 film into a cultural event. As a fan, being part of that scene felt like belonging to a secret club. Every VHS tape passed around. Every festival discovery felt like stumbling on buried treasure before the rest of the world caught on. And that sense of discovery wasn't just about quirky stories or edgy dialogue. It was about watching filmmakers dare us to see differently. Spike Lee, who really kicked this off, commanded attention with the unflinching social urgency of films like Do the Right Thing and Malcolm X, films that refuse to be ignored. Allison Anders gave voice to young women struggling to find their way in gas food lodging, showing lives Hollywood had overlooked. Each of these films stripped away the manufactured facade and insisted, this is what real looks like. For me, that was the heart of the indie film renaissance. It wasn't just the movies themselves, it was the audacity, the risk, the insistence that cinema could be anything, come from anywhere, and still matter. It felt like a secret that the whole world was slowly catching on to. That filmmaking wasn't just for the chosen few in Hollywood. It was for anyone bold enough to pick up a camera and tell their story. By the mid-90s, the rebellion was impossible to ignore. What had started as a whisper in a small theater and on grainy VHS tapes had become a roar that Hollywood could no longer tune out. Studios that once dismissed independent cinema suddenly wanted in. They launched boutique indie divisions, Fox Searchlight, Paramount Classics, Sony Pictures Classics, all hoping to capture the lightning that was sparking out of Sundance basements and Austin coffee shops. For the first time, the film establishment was trying to market rebellion, to turn authenticity into a brand. And it was strange watching it happen in real time. Directors who had once scraped together their films by maxing out those credit cards or calling in favors were suddenly on red carpets. They were in glossy magazines and showing up on those late night talk shows. Kevin Smith, who not long before had been working behind the counter at the very convenience store, was now being asked about the state of American cinema. Richard Linklater, who had made this meandering, plotless film in Slacker, was suddenly responsible for one of the decade's defining portraits of youth with Dazed and Confused. Robert Rodriguez, who shot El Mariachi on a shoestring budget, all while volunteering for medical experiments to pay his bills, was now orchestrating action in Desperado with Antonio Banderas and Salma Hayek. Watching that leap felt almost surreal. Yet, even as the budgets grew and the cameras got shinier, something essential remained. Dazed and Confused still carried the texture of lazy summer nights and restless youth. Desperado, for all its gunfights and its explosions, retained the scrappy energy of a director who once had to borrow equipment just to get a shot. Those films reminded us that the soul of cinema wasn't tied to spectacle or budget. It lived in audacity, in the willingness to risk failure by doing something different. And for us in the audience, the indie film renaissance was never just a passing fad. It was a new language. And once you heard it, you couldn't unhear it. We craved dialogue that sounded like our own conversations, awkward pauses and all. We wanted characters that mirrored our own frustrations, our odd obsessions, our dead-end jobs, our small-town boredom. These weren't superheroes or chosen ones. They were us, stumbling through life, sometimes brilliantly, sometimes pathetic. And that was the revelation. Watching these films, I didn't just feel entertained, I felt seen. That feeling carried weight. It wasn't simply the joy of recognizing yourself on screen. It was again the realization that anyone, anywhere with passion and vision could make their mark. If Kevin Smith could turn the monotony of working at a convenience store into a cult classic, if Rodriguez could turn a $7,000 experiment into a career, why couldn't others? The movement democratized the dream of filmmaking. It made it feel within reach, not just for the anointed few, but for anyone with a story and the determination to tell it. Of course, Hollywood tried to bottle that energy. They saw the buzz around films like Clerks and Reservoir Dogs, and they wanted their own versions. The problem there was that once rebellion becomes a product, it loses its teeth. The studio-backed indie films sometimes looked the part, with smaller casts or offbeat settings, but they rarely carried the rawness, the sense of risk. The originals felt like they could collapse at any moment, that the sound might fail, the scene might not land, the budget might run out. That fragility was part of their power. Studio imitations were polished, competent, and safe, but they lacked that urgency. And that's why the originals endured. They weren't trends, they were proof that creativity thrives when rules are broken, when boundaries aren't just pushed, but ignored altogether. They proved that a filmmaker didn't need permission to speak, didn't need millions to make art that mattered. That ethos, the idea that films could be made from the margins and still shake the center, was the real legacy of the movement. Even today, I see echoes of that era everywhere. A24 has become a modern torchbearer, championing films that are strange, uncomfortable, and vital. Streaming platforms make it possible for filmmakers to bypass the traditional gatekeepers entirely, releasing their work directly to audiences around the world. And on YouTube, TikTok, and countless other platforms, creators experiment with storytelling in ways that would have been unthinkable just 30 years ago during this boom. The spirit of the 90s indie wave, the insistence that stories can come from anyone, anywhere, still pulses through cinema. Looking back now, what moves me most is realizing that the indie film renaissance wasn't just about a handful of scrappy films that got lucky. It was about possibility. It was a reminder that storytelling doesn't need approval. It doesn't need massive budgets. It doesn't even need polish to matter. What it does need, though, is honesty, risk, and vision. Those filmmakers, Tarantino, Linklater, Rodriguez, Smith, Haynes, Lee, Anders, Gus Van Sant, and the list goes on, dared to be different, and in doing so, they didn't just change Hollywood. They changed the way I thought about movies, and maybe even the way I saw the world. Because once you realize that the barriers aren't as solid as they seem, that rules can be broken and doors can be kicked open and you can't go back to seeing things the same way. That was the gift of the indie film renaissance. It was more than entertainment, it was permission. And now I'll step off my soapbox, we'll go about our day, but we'll keep hopeful that Hollywood, that the film industry will get back to this. And while there will always be a place for your Marvel and DC comic book movies, there's enough room on these screens to tell the smaller stories, the independent stories, the stories that reflect us, our personal lives, our daily lives, our interests, our fears on the big screen. I'm Josh, and this has been a special Real Talk episode. I hope you enjoyed it. Let me know in the comments, what was your favorite of the indie renaissance? And are you hopeful that an indie renaissance will happen again? Let me know. Follow us anywhere you get the podcasts, Real Talk, at Real Talk on Instagram, Threads, Blue Sky, YouTube, TikTok. I'm on Substack, dropping occasional essays and film reviews. Check us out. And as always, I know there's a million options out there. Thank you for taking 30 minutes out of your day to listen to me ramble on. Enjoy.